Chapter 1. The World That Made Her, Georgian England on the Eve of a New Age. To understand Queen Victoria, one must first understand the world into which she was born, a world of extraordinary contradiction, of breathtaking grandeur existing alongside unspeakable misery, of an empire stretching across the globe while its own citizens starved in the shadows of its great cities. The England of the early 19th century was a place in violent, restless transformation, pulled between the old certainties of an aristocratic order and the insistent, thundering demands of a new industrial age. It was a world that needed, perhaps more than it knew, someone to embody its aspirations, to give human form to its ambitions, and to stand, steady and certain, at the center of the great storm of change. That person would be Victoria. The Georgian era, named for the succession of King Georges who had ruled Britain since 1714, was drawing to a close with something less than glory. King George III, who had reigned for nearly 60 years, had spent the last decade of his life confined to Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and lost in the labyrinthine corridors of madness, shuffling through rooms in his white dressing gown, playing his harpsichord to no one, conversing with people long dead. His son, the Prince of Wales, had served as regent since 1811, a man of considerable intelligence and cultural sophistication who had somehow allowed himself to become one of the most despised figures in the kingdom. The Prince Regent, who would become George IV in 1820, was a monument to excess, a man whose appetites for food, drink, women, architecture, and art were matched only by his talent for public humiliation and his utter indifference to the suffering of his subjects. The contrast between the ruler and the ruled had never been more vivid. While the Prince Regent feasted at Carlton House, commissioning the great architect John Nash to transform London and Brighton according to his extravagant visions, the ordinary people of England faced a crisis of staggering proportions. The Napoleonic Wars, which had consumed the energies and treasuries of Europe for more than a decade, had left Britain victorious but economically devastated. Soldiers returned from the fields of Waterloo and the sieges of Spain to find no work waiting for them, no place in the new order that their sacrifice had secured. The Corn Laws of 1815, passed by a parliament dominated by landowners, kept the price of bread artificially high, protecting the profits of the wealthy at the cost of the hunger of the poor. Food riots broke out across the country. Radical reformers gathered in fields and public spaces to demand representation, dignity, and bread. It was in this atmosphere of political tension and social upheaval that the event known to history as the Peterloo Massacre took place in August 1819, just 3 months after the birth of the princess, who would become Victoria. In St. Peter's Field in Manchester, a crowd of some 60,000 people had gathered peacefully to hear the radical orator Henry Hunt speak on the subject of parliamentary reform. The local magistrates, alarmed by the size of the crowd and gripped by the paranoia that had seized the ruling classes since the French Revolution, sent in the cavalry. The mounted soldiers charged into the densely packed crowd, sabers drawn. 15 people were killed and hundreds more were injured, many of them women and children who had come dressed in their best clothes, determined to make the occasion a dignified demonstration of working-class aspiration. The name given to the massacre, Peterloo, was a bitter joke, a sardonic echo of Waterloo, suggesting that the government was as willing to make war on its own people as it had been to make war on Napoleon. And yet, alongside this darkness, there was light, remarkable, dazzling light. This was the age of the Romantics, of Keats and Shelley and Byron, of Wordsworth communing with nature in the Lake District, of Mary Shelley conjuring the monster of Frankenstein from her restless imagination on the shores of Lake Geneva. It was the age of Jane Austen, who had completed her quiet, perfect novels just 2 years before Victoria's birth, mapping the intricate social landscape of provincial England with a precision that no historian has ever matched. It was the age of Turner, whose paintings seemed to dissolve the solid world into light and atmosphere, anticipating the impressionism that would flower later in the century. It was an age of invention and discovery, of Humphrey Davy experimenting with laughing gas and isolating new elements, of the engineer George Stephenson beginning to lay the iron roads that would transform the very geography of human existence. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the textile mills of Lancashire and the iron foundries of the Midlands in the middle of the previous century, was now accelerating beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. The steam engine, refined and improved through decades of engineering genius, was being applied to an ever wider range of tasks. Factories were replacing cottage industries. Cities were swelling with the mass migration of workers from countryside to town, from agricultural labor to industrial labor, from the rhythms of nature to the rhythms of the machine. Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool. These cities were growing at a rate that contemporaries found almost incomprehensible, doubling and tripling in size within a single generation. The landscape of England was being transformed. Green fields were replaced by red brick terraces, ancient forests by networks of canals, the silence of the countryside by the constant thudding roar of the factory. This transformation brought wealth, extraordinary, unprecedented wealth to some. The industrial and commercial middle classes were growing in prosperity, confidence, and political ambition. Manufacturers, bankers, merchants, lawyers, doctors. These were men who had made their own fortunes through industry and intelligence, and they were increasingly impatient with an aristocratic system that denied them political power while acknowledging their economic importance. The Reform Act of 1832 would give them their first significant foothold in Parliament. But in the years of Victoria's childhood, the battle for political representation was still being fiercely fought. For the working classes, however, the Industrial Revolution brought not wealth but a peculiarly modern form of misery. The factory system demanded long hours, rigid discipline, and the labor of women and children alongside men. Children as young as 5 and 6 worked in the coal mines, crawling through passages too narrow for adults, harnessed to coal carts like small animals. Others worked in the mills, their small fingers useful for tying the threads that larger hands could not reach. The death rate in the new industrial cities was appalling. Life expectancy in Manchester in the 1840s was barely 30 years, not because people were old at 30, but because so many died in infancy or childhood that the average was dragged catastrophically downward. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and the simple malnutrition that left bodies defenseless against every passing infection took the lives of the urban poor with brutal efficiency. Into this world, a world of radical change, of empire and poverty, of artistic achievement and social misery, of political ferment and aristocratic complacency, Victoria was born. She would not simply inhabit this world. She would shape it, give it a name, impose upon it something of her own extraordinary character. The Victorian age would become one of the most distinctive periods in human history, defined not only by its politics and its technology, but by its particular moral temper, its characteristic anxieties and aspirations, its way of understanding the relationship between the individual and society, between duty and desire, between the public self and the private heart. And that moral temper, in ways both subtle and direct, would bear the imprint of the woman at its center. But before Victoria could shape her age had to shape her. And the forces that shaped her were, in many ways, as peculiar and constraining as the contradictions of the world around her. She was born a princess, but a princess of uncertain prospects, one among several possible heirs to a throne that seemed, in those early years, to be occupied by men determined to produce no legitimate successors. She was born into a family that was, by any measure, deeply dysfunctional, riven by old hatreds and financial anxieties, and the particular cruelties that powerful people inflict upon those they love. She was born into an institution, the monarchy, that was at one of the lowest points of its popular prestige, mistrusted and mocked, seen by many as an expensive irrelevance or worse. The story of how this child, born in a minor royal palace on a spring morning in 1819, became one of the most powerful and influential figures of the 19th century, and how her reign both reflected and helped to create the world we still, in many ways, inhabit, is one of the most extraordinary stories in history. It is a story of personal courage and personal weakness, of great love and devastating grief, of political instinct and political failure, of an empire built on both genuine achievement and terrible injustice. It is, above all, a human story, the story of a woman who happened to be a queen and who spent her entire adult life trying to reconcile those two identities, the personal and the public, the private and the political, the woman and the monarch. That story begins, as all great stories must at the beginning. Chapter 2. A Princess is Born, Kensington Palace, 24 May 1819. In the early hours of the morning of 24 May 1819, in a suite of rooms at Kensington Palace in London, a young woman named Victoria Mary Louisa gave birth to her first child after what her doctors described as a relatively easy labor. The mother was 22 years old, a princess of the small German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Saalfeld, who had come to England 2 years earlier to marry Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III. The father, 51 years old, stood beside the bed and wept with relief and joy when the child was safely delivered. The baby was a girl. The birth had been attended by all the ceremony and official scrutiny that was required of royal births in that era, when the legitimacy of the succession was a matter of state importance. Several members of the government had been present or nearby, ready to certify that no substitution had taken place. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London had been roused from their beds. The Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, the same man who had authorized the cavalry charge at Peterloo, which would take place just 3 months later, was in attendance. All of this official witnessing was necessary because the question of who would succeed to the throne was, in the spring of 1819, a matter of considerable uncertainty and some urgency. The king, George III, was still nominally alive but had been effectively absent from the world for years, sealed in his apartments at Windsor in a state of complete mental incapacitation. The Prince Regent governed in his name. The Prince Regent himself had one child, Princess Charlotte, who had been the great hope of the succession, beautiful, spirited, enormously popular with the public, and married to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a personable and intelligent young man who would later become the King of the Belgians. But in November 1817, Charlotte had died in childbirth, and her stillborn son had died with her. The grief that swept through Britain was genuine and profound. People wept in the streets, shops closed, black clothes were worn by all classes. The loss of Charlotte was not merely the loss of a popular princess, but the loss of a symbol of hope, of the promise of a new and better reign. With Charlotte gone, the succession was in chaos. The Prince Regent had no other legitimate children. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a legal and personal catastrophe. The couple so mutually repulsed that they had separated almost immediately after the wedding. The Prince Regent's brothers, there were 6 of them surviving, had produced between them a remarkable number of illegitimate children, but almost no legitimate ones. The rules of the succession required that heirs to the throne be born in wedlock, and the brothers of George III had shown a thoroughgoing preference for extramarital arrangements. The crisis of Charlotte's death changed this almost overnight. Suddenly, the unmarried royal dukes found themselves under intense pressure from Parliament, from the public, and from the cold calculations of financial necessity to legitimize their domestic arrangements and produce legitimate heirs. 3 of them, the Dukes of Clarence, Kent, and Cambridge, contracted legal marriages within months of Charlotte's death. It was widely remarked at the time that this race to the altar was motivated less by romance than by arithmetic, and the remark was almost entirely accurate. Edward, Duke of Kent, was in some ways the most disadvantaged of the marrying dukes. He was 50 years old, had been living for 27 years with his French-Canadian companion, Madame de Saint Laurent, in what was by all accounts a genuinely loving and stable relationship, and was so deeply in debt that he could barely afford to live in England. But duty called, and Edward answered it with the methodical efficiency of a military man. He had served as a soldier, and not always a happy one, in various postings around the empire, most recently as governor of Gibraltar. He ended his long relationship with Madame de Saint Laurent, a separation that caused genuine pain to both parties, and began negotiations for a suitable princess. The suitable princess was Victoria Mary Louisa of Saxe-Coburg, the widow of the Prince of Leiningen and the sister of Leopold, who had been the husband of the lost Charlotte. She was handsome, practical, and possessed of a strong will that would make itself felt in the life of her daughter in ways she could not yet imagine. The marriage was arranged with efficiency and solemnized in 2 ceremonies, one in the German style in Coburg and one in the English style at Kew Palace in May and July 1818. 9 months later, their daughter was born. The child was christened Alexandrina Victoria, Alexandrina after her godfather, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and Victoria after her mother. The choice of names reflected the complicated politics of the royal family. The Prince Regent, who was not present at the christening, had tried to prevent the family from using the name Georgiana after himself, or Elizabeth, which he considered too regal for a minor princess who might never ascend to the throne, and the resulting compromise left the child with a first name that was never used. From the beginning, she was Victoria, or, in the family's private shorthand, Drina. The atmosphere at the christening was not harmonious. The Prince Regent, presiding with ill-concealed bad temper over the ceremony in the cupola room at Kensington Palace, seemed determined to undermine the occasion. When the time came to announce the child's names, he announced Alexandrina readily enough, then paused for so long before adding Victoria that the Duke of Kent, according to witnesses, nearly lost his composure entirely. The relationship between Edward and his older brother had always been difficult, and the christening was one of many small humiliations that the Prince Regent liked to inflict on those who could not easily retaliate. The child thus came into the world under the shadow of family discord, financial anxiety, and uncertain prospects. She was 5th in line to the throne, behind the Prince Regent, his brothers the Dukes of York, Clarence, and Kent himself. And while the death of Charlotte had elevated her theoretical importance, her actual position remained precarious. If the Duke of Clarence, who was now married to Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, were to produce surviving children, Victoria's place in the succession would recede further. As it happened, the Clarence children, 2 daughters, both named after the same aspirational baptismal tradition, died in infancy, but this could not have been known in 1819. What could not have been known, but what would prove decisive, was the character of the child herself, a character that would take time to reveal itself, that would be tested and shaped by the peculiar circumstances of her childhood, but that was already present in some essential form in those first hours at Kensington Palace. Victoria would prove to be, above all things, herself, direct, willful, passionate, capable of both extraordinary warmth and extraordinary coldness, possessed of a fierce sense of duty and an equally fierce sense of her own dignity. These qualities would make her, at different times in her long life, a great queen and a difficult person, a symbol of an age and a prisoner of her own temperament. But all of that was in the future. For now, she was simply a baby born on a May morning in a palace in London, her life stretching ahead of her, unimaginable and full of promise. Chapter 3: The Kensington System, a Gilded Cave. The first great tragedy of Victoria's childhood was also one of the first events she could remember, The death of her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, died on 23 January 1820 when his daughter was just 8 months old. He had caught a chill on a visit to Sidmouth in Devonshire, and the chill had rapidly become pneumonia. In those days before antibiotics, pneumonia in a man of 52 who had been weakened by debt, stress, and a lifetime of military campaigning was often a death sentence, and so it proved. He died holding the hand of his wife, the Duchess of Kent, who was thus left a widow for the second time, in a foreign country, with a baby daughter and debts that seemed to grow larger with each passing month. 6 days after the Duke of Kent's death, the old King George III finally died at Windsor after 10 years of madness and imprisonment. The Prince Regent became George IV. The Duke of York remained next in line, followed by the Duke of Clarence, and then, now that the Duke of Kent was gone, his daughter Victoria. The baby who had seemed a relatively minor figure in the royal succession was now, suddenly, one of the most important people in the kingdom. This importance was not immediately apparent in the circumstances of her life. The Duchess of Kent, bereft and financially desperate, retreated to Kensington Palace, where she was allowed to occupy a set of apartments that was adequate if not luxurious. She had almost no money, was dependent on the goodwill of the royal family for her accommodation, and spoke English imperfectly. She was a stranger in a strange land, responsible for the upbringing of a child who might one day be Queen of England, and she was not, by temperament or experience, equipped to bear that responsibility alone. Into this vacuum stepped a man who would shape the childhood of Victoria more than any other single figure, Sir John Conroy. Conroy was the controller of the Duchess of Kent's household, effectively her business manager and chief advisor. He was handsome, charming, ambitious, and almost entirely unscrupulous. He recognized, with an intelligence that was never in doubt, that the Duchess of Kent and her daughter were his best, and perhaps his only route to power and influence, and he cultivated his relationship with the Duchess with the same methodical efficiency that a gardener might bring to cultivating a rare and valuable plant. The precise nature of the relationship between Conroy and the Duchess of Kent has been debated by historians ever since. Some have argued that it was a romantic or even a sexual relationship. Others have suggested it was purely a professional alliance based on shared interests. What is beyond dispute is that Conroy exercised an extraordinary degree of influence over the Duchess, that she trusted him absolutely when she should have trusted him not at all, and that the system of childhood management he devised for Victoria, a system that came to be known, in whispers at first and later quite openly, as the Kensington system, was motivated at least as much by his own ambitions as by any genuine concern for the princess's welfare. The Kensington system was, at its core, a system of isolation and control. Its stated purpose was to protect the young princess from the corrupting influences of the court of George IV and later, of William IV courts that were, it must be said, genuinely not places of moral elevation. George IV's court was a place of intrigue and licentiousness. William IV was a blunt, well-meaning man but not notably refined. The Duchess of Kent, guided by Conroy, argued that Victoria required a sheltered, carefully supervised upbringing, far from the moral hazards of court life. In practice, this meant that Victoria was almost never alone. She was required to sleep in her mother's bedroom, sharing the room until she was 18 years old. She was never allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. She had no friends her own age, or rather, the friends she was allowed were chosen by the adults around her and carefully supervised during their visits. She was not permitted to meet or speak with any person who had not been vetted and approved by the Duchess and Conroy. She was watched, monitored, and reported on continuously. The purpose of this surveillance was not simply protection, it was power. By keeping Victoria isolated, the Duchess and Conroy ensured that she was entirely dependent on them for all information about the world, for all social contact, for all emotional support. They hoped that when she became queen, if she became queen, She would be so accustomed to relying on them that she would continue to do so, allowing them to exercise real power through her person. Conroy's particular ambition was to be appointed Victoria's private secretary when she ascended the throne, a position that would have given him enormous influence over the exercise of royal power. For Victoria, the Kensington system was both a prison and, in some ways, a paradoxical preparation for the life she would lead. The isolation was real and keenly felt. Victoria's journal, which she began keeping at the age of 13, is full of expressions of loneliness, of the longing for friendship and freedom. She craved companionship and warmth, and the controlled, artificial social world of the palace gave her very little of either. She was forced to find her emotional sustenance in a small circle of intimates: her governess, Baroness Leysin, her beloved dog, Dash, and in the early years her mother, though that relationship would become deeply complicated by the mother's complicity in the system of control. Leysin, Louise Leysin, the daughter of a German pastor, who had come to England as a governess to Victoria's half-sister, and then attached herself to the princess with a devotion that was both genuine and sometimes smothering, was perhaps the most important figure in Victoria's early emotional life. She was strict but kind, intellectually demanding but personally warm. She taught Victoria to love music and drawing, to take pleasure in the disciplines of learning, to hold herself with dignity and to speak with directness. She was also fiercely protective of Victoria against Conroy's encroachments, and this protective instinct, which Victoria recognized and was grateful for, made Leysin the most trusted person in her world. The educational program that the Kensington system provided for Victoria was, by the standards of the day and for a girl, actually quite rigorous. She studied history, geography, languages. She learned French, German, Italian, and Latin, music, and drawing. She was a diligent, if not always an inspired student. She herself admitted that she was not intellectual by nature, preferring action to contemplation. But she absorbed the education she was given, and it served her well in later life. Her languages were particularly useful. She corresponded with European relatives and heads of state in their own tongues, and her comfort with French and German gave her a fluency in European affairs that many English monarchs had lacked. But the most significant education she received was not formal at all. It was the education of observation, of learning to read the people around her, their ambitions, their manipulations, their genuine affections, and their calculated kindnesses. Growing up in the hothouse atmosphere of the Kensington system, surrounded by adults who were not always honest with her and who had interests not always aligned with her own, Victoria developed a penetrating, somewhat suspicious intelligence about human motivation. She learned to watch and to wait, to keep her own counsel, to reveal less than she knew. These instincts would make her, as a queen, both shrewd and sometimes maddening to those who served her. The other education that the Kensington system inadvertently provided was in the nature of constraint and its consequences. Victoria spent her childhood in a gilded cage, and she knew it. She chafed against the restrictions placed upon her, recorded her resentment in her journals, and nursed a stubborn determination to be free, truly free, in the full sense of the word, as soon as circumstances allowed. When freedom came, with the death of William IV in June 1837, her response was immediate and decisive. One of her first acts as queen was to order that her bed be moved out of her mother's bedroom. It was an act of symbolic assertion, but it was also something more. It was the declaration of a self that had been waiting, patient, and determined, through all the years of constraint, to emerge into the light. Chapter 4: Girlhood and Growing Awareness, the Making of a Queen. Victoria was 11 years old when she made a discovery that changed her understanding of herself and her destiny. The discovery was made, characteristically, not through some formal announcement or solemn ceremony, but through a book specifically, through a genealogical table that her governess, Baroness Leysin, had inserted into her history lesson. The table showed the royal succession, and it showed unmistakably that Victoria was very close to the throne, closer than she had realized. She had known, in some general way, that she was a princess and that she might one day become queen. But the clarity of seeing it laid out in black and white, the names and positions and the nearness of her own name to the top of the list, struck her with a force she would remember all her life. According to the account she gave later, an account that has the quality of a carefully constructed narrative, whether or not it accurately captures the exact moment of realization, she looked at the genealogical table for a long time, then looked up at Leysin and said, quietly and with great seriousness, "I see I am nearer to the throne than I thought." Leysin agreed that this was so. "There is much to do," Victoria said then. "I will be good." Whether or not the scene happened exactly as she described it, and there is some scholarly skepticism about the perfectly rounded quality of the anecdote, the sentiment it captures is entirely consistent with everything we know about Victoria's developing character. She had internalized, from her education and her observation of the world around her, a profound sense of duty, a conviction that the position she was to occupy was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be discharged, not a crown to be worn for its own glory, but a trust placed in her hands by history and by God. This conviction, which would deepen and strengthen throughout her reign, was one of the most important facts about her. The years of Victoria's adolescence were marked by increasing conflict between the world she was permitted to inhabit and the world she was beginning to understand. The Kensington system, in its most oppressive phase, coincided with the years between Victoria's 12th and 18th birthdays, the very years when a young person most needs freedom and independence to develop a sense of self. The princess was subjected to what she later called the torment of Conroy's attempts to dominate her, attempts that became increasingly aggressive as it became clear that she was approaching the age at which she might assume the throne. The most dramatic of these attempts came in the autumn of 1835, when Victoria fell seriously ill with typhoid fever while on one of the royal progresses. That Conroy organized tour of the English countryside that were partly genuine royal visits, and partly a publicity campaign designed to build up the image of the Duchess of Kent as the mother of the future queen, with Conroy as the indispensable manager of this important enterprise. While Victoria lay ill, feverish and frightened, Conroy attempted to force her to sign a document appointing him her private secretary when she became queen. He had her mother's support in this effort. Together, they stood over her sickbed and pressed her to sign. She refused. She was 16 years old, she was ill, she was frightened, and she refused. She maintained her refusal through days of pressure, weeping and angry and stubborn, but absolutely firm. The document was never signed. The incident left a permanent mark on Victoria's psyche, a deep, visceral aversion to being coerced, to being manipulated, to being treated as an instrument of other people's ambitions. It also left a deep and lasting bitterness toward her mother, who had participated in the attempt, and toward Conroy, whose machinations she had now seen with complete clarity. The tension within the Kensington system was exacerbated by the peculiar circumstances of the royal family in the mid-1830s. William IV, who had succeeded his brother George IV in 1830, was a bluff, good-natured, eccentric man who had spent most of his adult life in the Navy and who carried a certain nautical directness into his dealings with the world. He disliked the Duchess of Kent intensely and harbored a particular suspicion of Conroy. He was also, at 60, a man whose health was declining and the question of the succession was becoming urgent. William had no legitimate children. His only heirs were the various illegitimate children he had fathered with the actress Mrs. Jordan before his marriage, none of whom could inherit the throne. Victoria was his heir. William IV tried several times to establish a closer relationship with his niece, recognizing that she was being kept at an unhealthy distance from the rest of the royal family. The Duchess and Conroy resisted these attempts consistently, and the resistance was a source of real and publicly acknowledged conflict. At a dinner at Windsor Castle in August 1836, Victoria's 17th birthday party, the king made a speech in which he spoke bitterly about the way his niece was being kept from him, and about his determination that she would not be under the control of the Duchess of Kent when she became queen. The Duchess sat at the table in furious silence. Victoria wept. By the time of this dinner, however, two things had occurred that would soon render the Kensington system obsolete. One was the gradual deterioration of William IV's health. It was becoming clear that he would not survive for much longer, and that Victoria would be queen within months rather than years. The other was a visit, in the spring of 1836, that would change Victoria's life completely. The visit of two young German princes who were her cousins, Ernest and Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert at 16 was already striking. He was tall for his age, with regular, handsome features, blue eyes, and an air of quiet seriousness that distinguished him from the boisterous, pleasure-seeking young men who populated most royal courts. He was scholarly, earnest, musical, and possessed of strong moral convictions. He was also, by his own later admission, deeply uncertain about the prospect of becoming the consort of the Queen of England. Uncertain about whether he would be able to tolerate the subordinate position, the loss of independence, the life of ceremony and display that such a role would entail. Victoria, at 17, was immediately captivated. Her journal entries from the days of the cousins' visit are vivid with the enthusiasm of first love, or at least of strong infatuation. She noted Albert's beauty, his grace, his musicality. He sang with her and played the piano beautifully, his seriousness. She danced with him, rode with him, spent as much time in his company as the rules of propriety allowed. When he left, she felt his absence keenly. But the visit was only a beginning. There were more than 3 years still to pass before the question of Albert would be decided, and those years would be among the most consequential of Victoria's life. They would see her become queen, discover the nature of the power she had inherited, and experience for the first time the intoxication and the burden of being the center of the world. Chapter 5. The Crown at Last, June 1837. William IV died at Windsor Castle in the early hours of 20 June 1837. He had been ill for some weeks, his condition gradually worsening, and those around him had known for days that the end was approaching. At Windsor, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain kept a vigil, prepared to carry the news to Kensington the moment the king breathed his last. He died at 2 o'clock in the morning. Within the hour, the two men were at Kensington Palace. They were kept waiting at the door for some time. The palace was asleep, and it took a while for the urgency of their errand to communicate itself to the servants who answered their knock. When finally admitted, they asked to see the princess. They were told she was asleep. They insisted. A lady-in-waiting was sent to wake her. The princess came down to receive them, wrapped in a white dressing gown, her hair loose, her feet bare, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She was 18 years and 1 month old. The Archbishop of Canterbury knelt before her and told her that she was queen. She burst into tears. The tears were genuine. Whatever her preparation for this moment, however clearly she had seen it coming for years, the reality of it was overwhelming. She was young. She had been isolated and constrained throughout her childhood. She had been allowed very little direct experience of government or politics, and she had just been told that she was now the monarch of the most powerful empire in the world. Tears were the appropriate response. But the tears did not last long. What happened next has become one of the foundational stories of the Victorian era, the story of how a teenager, barely awake, without shoes, dressed in a white dressing gown, took hold of her destiny with a calm authority that astonished everyone present. She asked Lord Conyngham, the Lord Chamberlain, to give her a few moments alone, and she retired to write in her journal. The entry she made, "Since it has pleased Providence to place me in this station, I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country," has the quality of a prepared statement, but the composure it reflects was real. Over the next hours, she conducted herself with a poise that no one who had observed her sheltered, controlled upbringing could quite have predicted. She received the first formal documents of her reign. She met with her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, and she chaired her first Privy Council meeting that morning. The meeting was attended by some of the most senior statesmen in the kingdom, men of great age and long experience, men who had expected to feel, in the presence of an 18-year-old girl with no experience of government, a certain comfortable condescension. Instead, they were astonished. Lord Melbourne, who was one of the most experienced politicians in the kingdom, an urbane and sophisticated man who had served as Prime Minister before and knew everyone worth knowing, wrote afterward that the young queen had conducted herself with a dignity and self-possession that he had rarely seen in anyone, of any age or sex. Charles Greville, the diarist who attended the Privy Council and made his living by observing and recording the behaviors of the powerful, wrote that she was entirely self-possessed and that her manner was gracious and dignified. The Duke of Wellington, who had beaten Napoleon and governed armies, seemed moved. Every man present, whatever his previous expectations, left the chamber convinced that they had witnessed something extraordinary. What Victoria had learned in the isolation of the Kensington system, what that strange, suffocating childhood had inadvertently given her, was a quality of inner stillness, a capacity to be calm in chaos, to hold herself steady when everything around her was in motion. She had been watched her entire life. Being watched now by these powerful men was not so different from what she had always known. She had been judged her entire life. The judgment of these men was no more terrifying than the judgment of Conroy and her mother. She had been performing, in some sense, since birth, performing the role of the good princess, the dutiful daughter, the future queen, and now the performance was simply on a larger stage. There was also something else, the sense of release. The Kensington system was over. Conroy's power was broken. Her mother's control was finished. She was the queen, and she was answerable to no one in her private life, to no parent, no guardian, no self-appointed manager. For the first time in her life, she was free. The first weeks of her reign were characterized by a giddy, almost hectic enjoyment of this freedom. She moved through the days with a lightness and energy that charmed observers. She rode in the park. She went to the opera, to concerts, to dinners. She laughed, she danced, she talked. The young queen who emerged from the Kensington system was not the pale, broken creature that Conroy had hoped to mold. She was vivid, direct, full of life, confident in her judgment and her authority. She was also, it must be said, young and inexperienced in ways that mattered. The constitutional role she was required to play was complicated. The political landscape she was navigating was treacherous, and the man she chose as her primary guide through these first years, Lord Melbourne, was not always the wisest or most disinterested of advisors. Chapter 6. Melbourne, a Queen's Education in the Art of Rule. William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, was 58 years old when Victoria came to the throne, and he was in many ways the most interesting person in the kingdom. He had lived a life of considerable complexity. He had been an MP for 30 years, had served as Chief Secretary for Ireland, had been briefly Prime Minister in 1834, and was now serving his second term in that office. He was an aristocrat to his fingertips, polished, witty, and deeply skeptical of enthusiasm of all kinds. He had read widely and thought deeply, and he had arrived at a kind of elegant melancholy, a sense that most human endeavors were not entirely worth the effort, that change was almost always for the worse, and that the best a wise man could do was to manage events with grace and prevent the worst excesses of human folly. His personal life had been genuinely painful. His wife, the famous Lady Caroline Lamb, had conducted a spectacular and disastrously public affair with Lord Byron, had published a novel that thinly disguised her experience of that affair, and had eventually died, after years of mental instability, in 1828. His only son was intellectually disabled. He had carried these private sorrows with characteristic stoicism, maintaining his polish and his wit and his capacity for friendship while nursing, somewhere underneath the polished surface, a loneliness that his contemporaries sometimes caught glimpses of. With Victoria, Melbourne found something that his life had previously lacked: an uncomplicated affection, a sense of being genuinely needed and valued, and the opportunity to exercise his formidable intelligence in a relationship that was, by its very nature, free of the complications and self-interest that tainted most of his political relationships. He was her prime minister, yes, but he became something more than that. He became her teacher, her companion, her guide through the labyrinth of English politics and English society. He dined with her almost every day when she was in London. He rode with her in the park. He sat beside her at concerts and whispered witty observations in her ear. He wrote her long letters when they were separated, full of the history and politics and gossip that she found endlessly fascinating. Melbourne taught Victoria how to be queen in the most practical and immediate sense. He taught her the constitutional conventions she needed to understand, the protocols she needed to observe, the people she needed to handle carefully and those she could trust. He explained the working of Parliament, the nature of the party system, the delicate relationships between the Crown and the government. He was patient, clear, and always interesting. He had the gift of making even dry constitutional matters vivid by attaching them to stories about real people and real events. But Melbourne also shaped Victoria's political instincts in ways that would prove problematic. He was, by conviction and temperament, a Whig and a conservative, not the conservative of the Tory party, but a conservative of disposition, suspicious of reform, and deeply committed to the preservation of the existing social and political order. He believed that things should change as little as possible and as slowly as possible, and he communicated these views to Victoria with such consistent charm that she absorbed them almost without noticing. She became, under Melbourne's tutelage, instinctively conservative in her political sympathies, suspicious of radical change, and inclined to see Whig politicians as trustworthy and Tory politicians as potential threats. This Whig bias would lead her, in 1839, into the first significant political crisis of her reign, the crisis known to history as the Bedchamber Affair. When Melbourne's government lost a vote of confidence and resigned, it fell to Robert Peel, the leader of the Tory opposition, to form a new government. Peel, as was customary, requested that Victoria replace some of the ladies of the bedchamber, senior female attendants who served the Queen personally, with women who were the wives or relatives of Tory politicians. Victoria refused, with a vehemence that went far beyond what constitutional convention required. Her ladies, she declared, were personal appointments, and she would not have them changed. The constitutional arguments were complex, and the merits were genuinely uncertain, but it was clear to most observers that Victoria's determination was motivated at least as much by personal feeling as by constitutional principle. Her ladies were the wives and relatives of Whig politicians, many of them women she liked and trusted. The idea of replacing them with strangers, the wives of politicians she associated with the opposition to Melbourne, seemed to her both a personal affront and an attack on her independence. Peel, finding it impossible to form a government under these conditions, withdrew, and Melbourne returned to office. It was a victory of sorts for Victoria, but it was a victory that came at a cost. It made her seem, to many observers, partisan and immature, a young queen who had used her personal preferences to interfere in constitutional processes in ways that were not quite appropriate. The episode was a sign of how much she still had to learn. The lessons she was learning were not only political. She was also, throughout these years, learning about herself, her strengths and her weaknesses, her passions and her fears. She was discovering that she had a temper, and that the temper, when aroused, could lead her to say and do things she later regretted. She was discovering that she was susceptible to strong emotional attachments, to Melbourne, to lazen that could cloud her judgment. She was discovering, in short, that being a queen did not automatically make her wise. The wisdom would come, but it would come through a teacher more demanding than Melbourne and through lessons more painful than the bedchamber crisis. It would come through marriage. Chapter 7. Albert, the great love of a queen's life. In the autumn of 1839, when Victoria had been queen for 2 years and was 20 years old, her cousin Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha came to England for a second visit. The first visit, 3 years earlier, had made a vivid impression on the young Victoria. The second visit was to prove decisive for both of them. Albert arrived at Windsor on 10 October 1839, and Victoria's reaction was immediate and total. He had grown from the handsome boy she remembered into a young man of striking good looks and evident intelligence. He was 20 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with blue eyes and fine features. He had continued his education at the University of Bonn and had spent time in Italy, and the intellectual seriousness and moral earnestness that Victoria had noticed at their first meeting had deepened and matured. He spoke several languages, loved music, was passionate about the natural sciences, and possessed an administrative intelligence of the first order, a capacity for organized, systematic work that would prove one of his most valuable qualities in the years ahead. Within days of his arrival, Victoria knew what she wanted. The constitutional position was unusual. As queen, it was she who had to propose marriage, not he. This was one of the stranger inversions of normal social convention that her position imposed. She could not wait to be asked. She had to ask. And she did so on 15 October 1839, in a private audience at Windsor, calling Albert to her sitting room and telling him, with the direct simplicity that was characteristically hers, that she wanted him to marry her. Albert accepted. His acceptance was not without its complications. He had reservations about the role he was being asked to play, reservations about England and the English, reservations about whether he could be happy in a position so subordinate and so exposed. His uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, who had been carefully managing the relationship between the cousins for years, had prepared him as best he could. But no preparation could entirely eliminate the uncertainty. For Victoria, the acceptance was the beginning of a new world. She was transformed by the certainty of the love she felt for Albert, a love that was at once deeply personal and deeply political, the love of a woman for a man and the love of a queen for the partner she believed could help her govern well. She wrote to Melbourne, to her other friends, to everyone she knew, with an excitement that she could barely contain. She was, she told Melbourne, the happiest creature in the world. The wedding took place on 10 February 1840 in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a white dress, a choice that was somewhat unusual at the time, as white was not the conventional color for wedding gowns, but that would, through her example, gradually become the standard. She looked beautiful. Albert looked magnificent. The ceremony was attended by all the dignitaries of the kingdom, and the public lining the streets to watch the procession were, by most accounts, warmly enthusiastic. There was a revealing moment at the beginning of the ceremony that said something important about the dynamics of the marriage that was beginning. Victoria had decided, on mature reflection, and with Melbourne's advice, not to include the word obey in her wedding vows. This was a quietly radical decision for a woman to make in 1840, though it was perhaps less surprising in the case of a reigning queen than it might have been in any other. She would not promise to obey. She would love, comfort, honor, but she would not obey. The man she was marrying was to be her husband, but she was to remain the queen. Albert understood this from the beginning, and it caused him considerable difficulty in the early years of the marriage. He had been raised with the conventional expectations of a German prince, that a man was the head of his household, that his wife deferred to him in matters of substance. He was coming now into a household where his wife was not merely his social superior, but was literally, constitutionally, his sovereign. He was her subject, in law and in fact. She could not, under existing law, appoint him even as a regent. She had to petition Parliament to give him a defined constitutional position, and Parliament did so with some reluctance, granting him the style of Prince Consort only in 1857. The adjustment that Albert had to make was one of the most difficult any man could have been asked to make, and the fact that he made it, not merely accepted it, but actively engaged with his constrained position, and found within it a domain of genuine and important work, says something profound about his character. He was a man of remarkable ability and even more remarkable patience, and he brought both to the task of being Victoria's husband. In the early months of the marriage, there were real tensions. Albert found himself excluded from Victoria's political life. She was reluctant to share the red boxes, the official government dispatches, with him, reluctant to involve him in her meetings with ministers, jealous, perhaps, of the independence she had so recently won from Conroy and her mother. He found himself without a defined role, filling his days with the management of the royal households, which he improved significantly, and with music and study. He was homesick for Germany, uncomfortable in English society, which tended to regard Germans as somewhat comic, and occasionally lonely. But the partnership deepened, gradually and then decisively. Albert demonstrated over and over that his judgment was sound, his advice wise, his commitment to her and to the institution of the monarchy total. Victoria, who was not by nature inclined to share power, found that sharing it with Albert was not loss but gain, that his intelligence complemented her instincts, that his patience balanced her impulsiveness, that his seriousness of purpose anchored her more volatile emotions. She began to involve him more, to consult him more, to rely on his judgment in matters both political and personal. The evolution of their working partnership was gradual but steady. Within a few years of the wedding, Albert was effectively functioning as a co-regent, present at all Victoria's meetings with ministers, privy to all state papers, involved in all important decisions. This was constitutionally irregular. Prince Albert held no official position that gave him the right to this role, but it was accepted because it worked, because the ministers who dealt with him recognized his ability, and because Victoria's trust in him was absolute. And underneath the working partnership was the love that gave the partnership its emotional foundation, and that is perhaps the thing most people think of first when they think of Victoria and Albert. It was a love of great intensity and great constancy, a love that was also, like all loves, complex and sometimes difficult. Victoria could be jealous, demanding, and occasionally unreasonable. Albert could be distant, moralistic, and occasionally cold. They quarreled, Victoria more visibly and volcanically than Albert, who tended to process his feelings in long, carefully drafted letters rather than in face-to-face confrontation. But the quarrels were always resolved. The love was always renewed. And as the years went on and the children came, 9 of them in 17 years, a remarkable and somewhat exhausting family, the bond between them deepened into something that was not just love but mutual completion. Victoria without Albert was, as she later said, only half herself. The 21 years of their marriage were the years in which she became, slowly and sometimes painfully, the person and the monarch she would be for the rest of her long life. Chapter 8. The business of ruling, Albert's influence on the crown. The question of what Albert actually did, what his contribution to the reign of Victoria actually was, is one that historians have debated at length, and with some passion. In his own lifetime, he was often undervalued by the English public, who tended to regard him as a foreigner and something of a prig, a man too serious and too earnest for his own good. After his death, Victoria worked hard to rehabilitate his reputation, commissioning biographies and memorials, and relentlessly insisting to everyone who would listen that Albert had been the greatest man who ever lived. This insistence, understandable in its grief, but sometimes excessive in its expression, paradoxically made some people less inclined to take Albert seriously, as though his wife's advocacy was itself evidence of partiality. The truth, as best as historians can reconstruct it, is that Albert was genuinely important. Not a genius, perhaps, in the way that Victoria sometimes claimed, but a man of substantial intelligence, wide knowledge, and remarkable organizational capacity, who used these gifts in the service of the monarchy and of Britain in ways that left permanent marks on both. His most visible legacy is the Great Exhibition of 1851, a project that was in many ways his greatest achievement, and one that is worth examining in some detail both for what it was and for what it revealed about Albert's character and abilities. But the exhibition was the spectacular culmination of a decade of systematic reform that Albert had been quietly undertaking since the early 1840s. When Albert married Victoria, the royal household was a byword for inefficiency, waste, and absurdity. The management of the royal palaces was divided between a series of overlapping departments: the Lord Steward's Department, the Lord Chamberlain's Department, the Master of the Horses Department, each of which jealously guarded its own territories and responsibilities, none of which communicated effectively with the others. The result was a system in which, famously, the fires in the royal rooms were lit by one department, but the coal was procured by another, meaning that coal was sometimes delivered to rooms that had no fireplaces, while fireplaces in other rooms went cold for lack of coal. Servants who were nominally employed by the palace often did very little actual work, protected by the complex tangle of departmental loyalties from any meaningful accountability. Albert imposed order on this chaos with the systematic efficiency of a Prussian administrator. He rationalized the management of the households, created clear lines of responsibility, eliminated redundancies, and introduced what would today be called modern management practices. The savings in money were significant. The improvement in actual service was even more significant. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Osborne House, the new house on the Isle of Wight that Victoria and Albert had purchased and Albert had effectively designed, were transformed from monuments to aristocratic slovenliness into models of efficient management. This administrative reform was important in itself, but it was also important as a signal of what Albert represented. He was bringing the values of the new industrial and professional middle class: efficiency, rationality, accountability, the belief that performance could and should be measured, into the heart of the oldest of British institutions. The monarchy, under his influence, was modernizing itself. It was becoming, in some essential way, more Victorian. Albert's influence on the political culture of the monarchy was equally significant, though less easily summarized. He was, by conviction and by instinct, a monarchist, but a monarchist of a particular kind. He believed that the monarch should stand above party politics, that the crown should be a unifying force in national life, representing all the people rather than any faction. This belief, which was in some tension with Victoria's own instinctive partisanship, her Whig sympathies, her distrust of Tories, and later her partisan attachment to certain prime ministers, shaped the way he advised her in her dealings with ministers of different parties. Over time, and not without considerable effort, he managed to persuade Victoria that a queen who was seen to favor one party over another was a queen who was undermining her own authority and popularity. The constitutional monarch, as Albert envisioned the role, was a figure who was genuinely above politics, who read all the dispatches, understood all the positions, could discuss the issues with ministers of any party from a position of genuine knowledge, and who served as a kind of constitutional conscience, reminding the government of the long-term interests of the nation when short-term political calculations threatened to obscure them. This vision of the monarchy as a non-partisan, professionally managed institution that served the national interest rather than the interests of any class or party was Albert's greatest contribution to British political culture. It was not fully achieved in his lifetime, and Victoria's later career would see significant departures from it. But it established a template, an ideal of constitutional monarchy that would be influential for generations, and that would eventually become something close to orthodoxy in the conduct of the British Crown. Albert was also deeply engaged with the cultural and intellectual life of the nation in ways that went well beyond his official role. He was a serious musician, he composed. He played the organ and the piano, he sang. He was a genuine student of the visual arts, with an eye for quality and an understanding of art history that was unusual for a man of his position. He reformed the management of the Royal Art Collection, commissioned new works, and was genuinely influential in shaping the cultural patronage of the crown. He was fascinated by science and technology, attended lectures by leading scientists, corresponded with engineers and inventors, and was an enthusiastic supporter of the Great Exhibition, which was, in part, a celebration of science and industry applied to the improvement of human life. All of these qualities and activities made Albert an important figure in the public life of the nation, not merely an appendage to his wife. He was taken seriously by serious men, by scientists, engineers, politicians, artists, in ways that not all royal consorts managed to achieve. And the seriousness with which he was taken reflected back onto Victoria herself, lending her reign a quality of intellectual weight and purposefulness that it might otherwise have lacked. But Albert paid a price for his constant activity, his relentless commitment to work. He had always been somewhat fragile constitutionally, prone to stomach ailments, to colds, to a general susceptibility to illness that his friends noted with concern. The demands that he placed on himself were enormous. He worked extraordinarily long hours, involved himself in an almost impossibly wide range of projects and responsibilities, and gave to each the same meticulous, thorough attention. He did not rest easily. He could not switch off. And as the years passed, the pace he maintained began to wear him down in ways that his close companions found increasingly alarming. Chapter 9. Family Life, 9 Children and the Architecture of a Dynasty. Victoria and Albert had 9 children over the course of 17 years, and the story of those children, who they were, how they were raised, what they became, and how they reflected and sometimes refracted the values and contradictions of their parents, is a story that eventually encompassed almost all of Europe. The first child, a daughter christened Victoria but almost always called Vicky, was born on 21 November 1840, 9 months and 11 days after the royal wedding. Victoria's experience of childbirth was, by all accounts, one of the most consistently terrifying aspects of her life. She found pregnancy physically uncomfortable, felt it robbed her of her dignity and freedom, and found the pain of labor genuinely appalling. She was also afraid, with good reason, given what had happened to her cousin Charlotte, who had died in childbirth. The fear never entirely went away, even as the births accumulated. The second child, Edward, Prince of Wales, always called Bertie within the family, was born in November 1841, and his birth was greeted with national celebration, as it secured the succession in the male line. Victoria and Albert had very different reactions to their son and heir, and those differences would generate one of the defining tensions of the family's internal life for decades. Albert had high, perhaps impossibly high, expectations for his son. He saw in Bertie the opportunity to create, from scratch, the perfect prince, educated, serious, morally impeccable, intellectually engaged. He subjected the boy to an educational program of extraordinary rigor, and when Bertie failed to respond to it with the intellectual enthusiasm his father hoped for, could not conceal his disappointment. Victoria, for her part, had a complicated and often difficult relationship with all her children, but particularly with her eldest son. She found Bobby's tedious and small children trying, and her natural inclination toward directness and high standards did not make her an obviously natural mother. She loved her children fiercely, but was not always able to express that love in ways they could recognize. And Bertie, who was warm-natured, sociable, and temperamentally unsuited to the sort of scholarly, morally earnest existence his father envisioned for him, became a particular source of maternal anxiety and disappointment. The later children arrived at intervals over the following years: Alice, 1843, Alfred, 1844, Helena, 1846, Louise, 1848, Arthur, 1850, Leopold, 1853, and Beatrice, 1857. Each of them developed their own distinct character, found their own way through the complexities of royal life, and eventually married into the royal houses of Europe. So many of them, and their children after them, that Victoria came to be known, in her old age, as the grandmother of Europe. The royal nurseries and schoolrooms at Windsor and Osborne were presided over by a succession of nurses and tutors, but the tone was set by Albert, who took the education of his children extremely seriously and was more involved in their daily lives than most Victorian fathers of his class. He designed their educational programs, supervised their lessons, took them on walks and explained the natural world to them, introduced them to music and art and science. He was, in many ways, an attentive and involved father, though his high standards could make the experience of being his child somewhat daunting. The family's private life centered on two houses in particular: Windsor Castle, the great medieval fortress in Berkshire that had been a royal residence since the Norman conquest and that Albert extensively improved, and Osborne House, on the Isle of Wight, which Victoria and Albert purchased in 1845 and rebuilt according to Albert's own designs in an Italianate style. Osborne was the place where the family was most itself, where the children ran on the beach, where Victoria and Albert walked in the gardens in the evenings, where the formal demands of court life were briefly relaxed and something closer to normal family life could be approximated. The family also developed a deep attachment to Scotland, and particularly to Balmoral in Deeside, a castle that they purchased in 1848 and that became, over time, perhaps the most beloved of all the royal residences. Scotland suited both Victoria and Albert. Its wild landscapes, its clean air, its Protestant seriousness, and its Highland traditions appealed to something in both their characters. Victoria loved the informality that Highland life permitted, the sense of being closer to nature and to the simple rhythms of rural existence. Albert loved the shooting and the walking and the crisp autumn air. Both of them found in Scotland a relief from the pressures and protocols of London life that they valued enormously. It was at Balmoral that the family enjoyed some of its happiest times, times that Victoria would remember in later years with an almost painful nostalgia. She and Albert would ride out in the hills together, scrambling up mountains, getting lost in the heather, returning to the castle tired and windswept and happy. The children roamed the estate, fished in the rivers, climbed the hills. For brief, golden periods, the family was simply that. A family, not an institution, not a symbol, not a dynasty, but a group of people who loved each other and were happy in each other's company. These happy periods were possible because Albert created them, because his energy and his organizational intelligence and his genuine love of family life made them possible. And when Albert was gone, these happy times would become the measure by which Victoria assessed everything that followed. Nothing, she believed with utter certainty, could ever be as good as what she had had with him. Chapter 10. The Great Exhibition of 1851, A World Displayed. The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, which opened in Hyde Park, London, on 1 May 1851, was one of the most remarkable events in the history of the 19th century, and it was, in very large measure, Albert's creation. The idea had been germinating for years, growing out of various smaller industrial exhibitions that had taken place in England and France. The concept was simple and audacious: to gather together the products of human industry and ingenuity from every nation on earth, to display them in one great space, and to use this display to celebrate the progress of civilization, to stimulate trade and cultural exchange, and to demonstrate to the world the preeminence of British manufacturing while also acknowledging the achievements of other nations. Albert threw himself into the organization of the exhibition with the same comprehensive energy he brought to everything he undertook. He chaired the Royal Commission that oversaw the project, mediated between the competing interests of manufacturers, artists, civil servants, and politicians, dealt with the enormous practical problems of finding a suitable site and a suitable building, and maintained his own vision of what the exhibition should be, not merely a trade fair, but a statement about the relationship between industry, art, and civilization, in the face of considerable skepticism and resistance. The building in which the exhibition was housed was itself one of the greatest achievements of the undertaking. The Crystal Palace, designed by Joseph Paxton, a gardener turned architect who had gained his experience building great glass houses for the Duke of Devonshire, was a structure of extraordinary beauty and engineering ingenuity. It was a vast greenhouse of glass and iron, covering 19 acres of Hyde Park. Large trees were incorporated into the design rather than felled, capable of housing the exhibition's 6 million objects while allowing natural light to flood through its transparent walls. It was also, crucially, completely prefabricated, its standard components manufactured in factories and assembled on site, making it possible to erect the structure in an astonishingly short time. The exhibition opened on a May morning that was, for once, sunny and glorious, and the opening ceremony was one of the most spectacular events of Victoria's reign. She processed through the exhibition with Albert and the children, greeted by the choirs of 600 voices and the playing of the Hallelujah Chorus, surrounded by the products of the world's industry arranged along the Great Nave. Machinery from Britain's factories, ceramics from France, silks from China, jewels from India, scientific instruments from Germany, agricultural implements from America. She was moved to tears by the beauty and grandeur of the occasion, and her journal entry for the day is one of the most ecstatic pieces of prose she ever wrote. The exhibition was a triumph by every measure. 6 million people visited it in the 5 months it was open, a figure that was almost incomprehensible given that the entire population of London at the time was around 2.5 million. People came from all over Britain and from all over the world, traveling on the new railways, staying in the new hotels that had been hastily constructed to receive them. The exhibition made a substantial profit. The surplus was used to purchase the land in South Kensington that would eventually house the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Royal Albert Hall, a cluster of cultural institutions that was one of the most significant acts of philanthropic patronage in British history. But the exhibition meant more than its organizational achievements, significant as those were. It was a statement of faith in progress, in the capacity of human ingenuity to improve human life, in the possibility of international cooperation and understanding. It was, in its optimism and its energy, the most perfect expression of what the Victorian age believed about itself and about the world it was making. And Albert was its presiding genius. It was his vision, his energy, his administrative skill, and his conviction that made it possible. Victoria, watching her husband manage the exhibition and seeing the public recognition that it brought him, felt a pride in him that she expressed with characteristic directness. He had proven himself, in the eyes of the world, to be exactly what she had always known him to be, a man of exceptional quality. The exhibition was the high point of Albert's public career, the moment when his contribution to British life was most clearly and most publicly visible. It was also, in some ways, the summit of the reign's optimism, the moment when the future seemed most clearly to be on the side of progress, civilization, and peace. Chapter 11, The Crimean War, the Price of Empire. The optimism of 1851 was not to last. The decade that followed the Great Exhibition brought difficulties and disappointments that tested Victoria and Albert's partnership and their relationship with the British public in ways that the exhibition's triumphs could not have foreshadowed. The most serious of these tests was the Crimean War, which broke out in 1853 and continued until 1856. The war was fought between Russia on one side and an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually Sardinia on the other, and its immediate cause was a dispute over the rights of Christian minorities in the Holy Land that escalated through a series of diplomatic miscalculations and national miscalculations into a full-scale military conflict. For Britain, the Crimean War was a traumatic experience. The war itself was fought badly, not because British soldiers lacked courage, which they possessed in abundance, but because the organization of the British Army had not been modernized since the Napoleonic Wars and was, by the 1850s, a monument to aristocratic privilege, administrative incompetence, and the consequences of never having to fight a serious war for 40 years. Officers purchased their commissions rather than earning them through merit. Supply and logistics were handled by a system so tangled and inefficient that soldiers sometimes starved in sight of food that could not be distributed to them. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and disease, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, killed far more men than Russian bullets. The suffering of the British soldiers in the Crimea was reported home in a way that was new in British military history. The development of the telegraph allowed news to reach London with unprecedented speed, and newspapers, in particular, The Times, whose correspondent William Howard Russell was one of the first war correspondents in the modern sense, brought vivid accounts of the catastrophic conditions in the field to a public that was simultaneously horrified and outraged. It was this combination of public outrage and desperate medical need that created the opportunity for Florence Nightingale, who arrived in the Crimea in November 1854 with 38 nurses and a determination to reform the military hospital at Scutari. Nightingale's achievements in the Crimea, reducing the death rate at Scutari from more than 40% to just over 2% through a combination of improved sanitation, better food, and rigorous organization, made her the most famous woman in Britain, second only to the Queen herself. She also laid the foundation for modern professional nursing, and her post-war work in reforming military medicine and the conditions of hospitals transformed healthcare in Britain. Victoria followed the Crimean War with intense engagement. She visited the wounded at Chatham, reviewed the troops, corresponded with commanders and ministers, and wore the Crimean ribbon. She also established in 1856 the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Armed Forces, awarded for valor in the presence of the enemy. The first Victoria Crosses were distributed by the Queen herself in a ceremony in Hyde Park, and the medal, with its simple design and its Latin inscription that means "for valor," became one of the most powerful symbols of military courage in the world. The war ended in March 1856 with the Treaty of Paris, which imposed conditions on Russia and secured, at least temporarily, the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire. Britain emerged from the war nominally victorious but deeply shaken. The exposure of the military's failings had driven a program of reform, of the purchase of commissions, of the medical services, of the logistics of supply, that began to modernize the army in ways that would prove important in the decades ahead. The war had also revealed something about the nature of modern warfare, that it was no longer simply a matter of courage and discipline, but of industrial organization, of technology, of the capacity to sustain a modern army in the field over a sustained campaign. For Victoria and Albert, the Crimean War was also a personal and political test. Albert's German origin had made him suspect in the eyes of some during the war, when he was accused, with no foundation whatsoever, of leaking military information to the Russians. The accusation was absurd, but it reflected a persistent undercurrent of distrust of the foreign prince, a sense that his loyalties were not quite English. Albert bore these accusations with characteristic dignity, but they hurt him, and they reminded both him and Victoria of how fragile their position in public opinion could be. The years after the Crimean War were years of increasing difficulty for Albert, whose health, never robust, began to show signs of serious deterioration. He was working harder than ever, involved in an enormous range of projects, managing the royal households, advising Victoria on every aspect of her political life, overseeing the education of the children, conducting an enormous correspondence. His chronic stomach problems worsened. He slept badly. Those around him noticed that he seemed worn down, the brightness of his earlier years dimmed by the accumulation of responsibility and worry. And there were new worries. The Bertie question, the question of how to handle the wayward Prince of Wales, was a constant source of anxiety. In the autumn of 1861, Albert received news that Bertie, stationed with his regiment in Ireland, had been involved with an actress named Nellie Clifton. Albert was profoundly distressed by this information, not merely as a father, but as a man who had devoted enormous energy to the project of making Bertie the kind of prince he believed Britain needed. He traveled to Cambridge, where Bertie was studying, to remonstrate with his son in person. The journey was made in November, in cold, wet weather. Albert was already unwell. Chapter 12. The Death of Albert, the Great Catastrophe. The death of Prince Albert at Windsor Castle on the evening of 14 December 1861 was one of those historical events that divide a life into two halves, before and after. Victoria was 42 years old. She would live for another 40 years, but nothing that followed would ever be for her quite what it had been. The life that came after Albert's death was a different life, lived differently, experienced differently, understood differently from the life that had preceded it. Albert had fallen ill in the days after his visit to Cambridge. He was feverish, exhausted, and in pain. The doctors who attended him, and there were many of them, as was customary for royal patients, a council of medical men who sometimes agreed and sometimes did not, diagnosed his condition variously as gastric fever, typhoid fever, and a kind of general exhaustion that they did not quite know how to treat. Looking back from the perspective of modern medicine, it seems likely that Albert was suffering from a combination of conditions, possibly including stomach cancer, which would explain the chronic digestive problems that had troubled him for years, as well as the more acute illness that killed him. Victoria's diary entries from the weeks of Albert's illness are some of the most heartrending documents in the archive of her long life. She records, day by day, the oscillations of hope and fear, the moments when he seemed to rally, and the moments when it was clear that he was failing. She sat with him constantly, holding his hand, talking to him, reading to him, refusing to accept what the evidence of her senses and the faces of the doctors told her was coming. On the evening of 14 December, the end came. Albert lay in his bed at Windsor, his breathing increasingly shallow, the household gathered around him. Victoria sat beside him, holding his hand. The children came in, one by one, to say goodbye. Albert died quietly, without apparent pain, at around 10 o'clock in the evening. Victoria's grief was immediate, total, and, as became clear in the weeks and months that followed, of a duration and intensity that went well beyond what even those closest to her had expected. She was not simply mourning her husband. She was mourning the partner who had, over 20 years of marriage, become so thoroughly integrated into her sense of herself that she genuinely did not know, in his absence, who she was. The grief expressed itself in ways that alarmed her court and eventually alienated significant sections of the public. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, refusing to open parliament, refusing to appear at state occasions, refusing to perform the public functions of the monarchy that were increasingly understood to be part of its social contract with the people. She dressed in black from the day of Albert's death until the day of her own, 40 years later. She kept his clothes laid out, his shaving things prepared. His chair at the table, as if at any moment he might return and take his place again in the life from which he had been so suddenly and so incomprehensibly removed. She spoke of him constantly, in public and in private, with an intensity that made even those who sympathized with her grief uncomfortable. She insisted that photographs of Albert be placed everywhere, in every room of every royal residence, at her bedside, in her dressing room. A cast of his hand sat on her desk. She slept beside a cast of his face. These rituals of memorialization, which were not entirely unusual in the grief culture of Victorian England but which she practiced with exceptional thoroughness, were her way of maintaining a connection with him that death had broken. The public's response to her grief went through several phases. At first, there was genuine sympathy. The death of the Prince Consort was a genuine national loss, and the Queen's grief was understood and honored. But as the months turned into years and Victoria continued to retreat from public view, sympathy began to harden into impatience. People began to ask what they were paying for if the Queen was not going to be seen. Radical voices began to question the value of the monarchy itself. Republican sentiment, which had been a minor current in British political life since the early years of the century, gained a new and more significant hearing. The crisis of Victoria's popularity in the late 1860s and early 1870s was one of the most serious challenges the monarchy faced in her reign. She was not entirely absent from public life. She continued to see her ministers, to read her dispatches, to sign documents, to write the enormous volume of letters that was her characteristic form of communication. But the public face of the monarchy, the visible, ceremonial presence that was one of the things a constitutional monarch was expected to provide, had largely disappeared. What began to call her back, gradually and with considerable resistance on her part, was a combination of political pressure, personal loyalty, and the emergence of a politician who understood both her needs and the needs of the monarchy in a way that no one since Melbourne had quite managed. Chapter 13. John Brown, Highland servant, devoted friend. In the years immediately following Albert's death, Victoria found comfort in an unexpected source. John Brown, a Highland gillie, a servant who cared for the horses and accompanied the family on outdoor expeditions, who had served the royal family at Balmoral since the 1840s and who had become a particular favorite of Albert's in the last years of his life. Brown was everything that the conventional courtiers around Victoria were not. He was blunt where they were diplomatic, direct where they were circuitous, unceremonious where they were obsequious. He addressed Victoria with a casual familiarity, calling her woman on occasion, which would have been unthinkable from anyone else, that she found, paradoxically, deeply refreshing. He treated her like a person rather than a queen, and in the desolation of her grief, this was exactly what she needed. The relationship between Victoria and Brown has been one of the most discussed and most speculated about aspects of her life. Contemporary gossip, which was sometimes vicious, suggested that the relationship was sexual, that Victoria had secretly married Brown, that she was Mrs. Brown in private life. The gossip was almost certainly untrue. What was true was that Victoria's attachment to Brown was genuine, deep, and by the standards of Victorian court etiquette, extraordinarily unconventional. Brown became, over the years, a daily presence in Victoria's life at Balmoral and elsewhere. He held her horse, helped her in and out of carriages, attended her on walks, handed her things, performed the functions of a personal attendant with a directness and physical ease that no one else in her household was permitted to exercise. She gave him a fixed and privileged position, resisted all attempts by courtiers and family members to curtail his influence, and mourned him genuinely and deeply when he died in 1883. The courtiers hated him. He was rude to them. He overstepped the boundaries of his station constantly, and most unforgivably, he had an influence over the Queen that they lacked and could not acquire. They mocked him behind his back and resisted him to his face, and they were rebuffed with a consistency that told them clearly where the power lay. Victoria was the Queen, and the Queen had decided that John Brown was to be treated with respect. Brown's importance in Victoria's life was partly practical. He was genuinely good at the functions he performed, and his physical strength and reliability were real assets in a period when the Queen was still frequently outdoors and active. But his importance was also emotional. He was a reminder of Balmoral, which was a reminder of Albert. He had known Albert, had served Albert, had been trusted by Albert. His presence was a link to the life she had lost. More than that, he offered her a kind of uncomplicated human company that the formality of court life denied her. The people around Victoria, the courtiers, the ladies-in-waiting, the politicians, even her own children, all had their own interests and agendas, their own needs from her, their own desire for her approval. Brown wanted nothing from her except to serve her well. This simplicity was immensely restoring. The Brown episode is sometimes used to illustrate what might be called the eccentric or self-indulgent side of Victoria's character. The side that, set free from Albert's moderating influence, could pursue its impulses without sufficient regard for the consequences. There is some truth in this, but the Brown relationship also illustrates Victoria's genuine human need for warmth and companionship, a need that her position made it very difficult to satisfy in ordinary ways. She was, despite the trappings of majesty, a woman who needed to be loved and who found ways to be loved even when the world conspired to make that difficult. Chapter 14. Disraeli, the Art of Flattery and the Empress of India. If John Brown offered Victoria human warmth in her private life, Benjamin Disraeli offered her something equally powerful in her political life: the experience of being admired and understood by a man of genuinely exceptional ability, who knew exactly how to present his admiration in ways she found irresistible. Disraeli was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable politicians of the 19th century. He was a novelist, a dandy, an adventurer, an opportunist of genius, and a political strategist of exceptional skill. He was also a Jew who had converted to Christianity in childhood, a fact that remained a significant part of how others perceived him throughout his life, though Disraeli himself wore his Jewish origin as a kind of distinction rather than hiding it as a liability. He was the first and only person of Jewish birth to become Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he achieved this in a country and an era that was significantly less tolerant of Jews than the modern world it helped to create. Disraeli's genius for politics was inseparable from his genius for personal relationships. He understood with an almost uncanny precision what each person he needed to influence wanted and needed from him, and he provided it with the theatrical flair of a born performer. With Victoria, what he provided was flattery, extravagant, constant, creative flattery, delivered with the air of a man who was not flattering at all, merely stating obvious truths. He told her she was great. He told her she was wise. He told her that her judgment was invariably sound and her instincts invariably correct. He told her that the history of Britain would, in future ages, look back on her reign as the most glorious in the national story. He called her the fairy in his letters, a reference to Spenser's Fairy Queen that was fanciful and slightly absurd, but that Victoria found enchanting. He dedicated his novels to her. He presented her with the first edition of his political works, with a little note saying that they were now entirely hers. Glamorously and cleverly, he also gave her something concrete: the Royal Titles Act of 1876, by which Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The proclamation had been planned and prepared as a political gift. Disraeli knew that Victoria had long wanted the title, had felt it appropriate given the scale and importance of the Indian Empire, and had been frustrated by the resistance of various politicians and advisors. Disraeli swept that resistance aside with his characteristic combination of political cunning and theatrical timing. And he presented the fait accompli to Victoria with the pleasure of a man giving the perfect present to someone he genuinely delights in pleasing. Victoria, who responded to flattery with an enthusiasm that was sometimes characterized, unkindly, as vanity, loved Disraeli with a wholeheartedness that she extended to very few of her political servants. She wrote him warm, intimate letters. She visited him at his house, Hughenden, in Buckinghamshire, which was a remarkable act of royal condescension for a visit to a politician's private residence. She sent him flowers and novels and primroses from the royal gardens. When he died, in April 1881, she mourned him with something approaching the grief she had felt for Albert, and she regularly placed primroses on his statue. They had become, somewhat artificially, his favorite flower in the mythology of their relationship. The Disraeli years, the years when he was Prime Minister, from 1874 to 1880, were among the happiest of Victoria's later life. They were years of active engagement with political life, years when the monarchy seemed genuinely important, and when the partnership between the Prime Minister and the Queen was a creative one. They were also years of significant imperial expansion. The purchase of a controlling share in the Suez Canal Company in 1875, the proclamation of the Empress title in 1876, the extension of British influence in southern Africa and in Afghanistan, that raised uncomfortable questions about the costs and consequences of imperial ambition. The Afghan adventure, in particular, was one that would have consequences. The attempt to impose British influence on Afghanistan, driven by anxieties about Russian expansion into Central Asia, led to military disaster at Maiwand in 1880, when a British force was routed by Afghan tribesmen, and complicated political difficulties that would rumble on for years. The scramble for Africa that accelerated in the 1880s and 1890s brought Britain into possession of vast new territories, but also into conflicts with other European powers, with African societies and rulers, and eventually with the Boer settlers of South Africa, that would prove enormously costly. Victoria was not simply passive in relation to these imperial enterprises. She followed them closely, corresponded with commanders in the field, expressed strong opinions about policy, and occasionally intervened in ways that went beyond the conventional role of a constitutional monarch. Her feelings about the empire were genuine and complex. She was proud of it. She felt a genuine personal connection to the peoples it governed. She learned Urdu in the 1890s and employed an Indian secretary, Abdul Karim, with whom she formed a close friendship that caused almost as much court controversy as her relationship with Brown. And she believed that British rule brought genuine benefits to the peoples it governed. But she could also be horrified by the violence and injustice that imperial expansion sometimes involved. Chapter 15, Gladstone, the Great Adversary. If Disraeli was the politician Victoria loved, William Ewart Gladstone was the politician she could not bear. The contrast between her feelings for the two men was so extreme and so widely known that it became one of the defining elements of the political culture of the era. Gladstone was aware of it, found it puzzling and frustrating, and occasionally allowed his frustration to show in ways that only confirmed the Queen's negative assessment of him. Gladstone was, by any objective measure, one of the great politicians of the 19th century. He was the dominant figure in British politics for the last 30 years of Victoria's reign, serving as Prime Minister 4 times in 1868-74, 1880-85, 1886, and 1892-94, and reshaping the Liberal Party into the instrument of progressive reform that it remained for a generation. He was a man of genuine intellectual distinction, deeply read in theology, Greek literature, and political philosophy, of enormous personal integrity, and of passionate commitment to what he conceived as the moral principles that should govern political life. His relationship with Victoria began badly and never fundamentally improved. The first signs of trouble came early in his first premiership, when Gladstone made the mistake of treating Victoria not as a constitutional monarch who needed to be charmed and managed, but as an intelligent participant in political deliberation who could be addressed with rational arguments and expected to respond to them. He wrote her long, carefully argued memoranda on political questions, marshaling evidence and logic in the manner of an academician addressing a scholarly audience. Victoria, who was accustomed to being treated with ceremony and delicacy, found these epistles exhausting and alienating. Disraeli, by contrast, had said of his own approach to the Queen that he never denied, never contradicted, sometimes forgot, and his successor's direct and argumentative manner felt, to Victoria, like a form of disrespect. The personal chemistry was wrong in other ways too. Gladstone was a high church Anglican of deeply moralistic convictions, who brought to political life an earnestness that Victoria found oppressive. He had, as someone once said, no small talk. He addressed every subject with the full weight of his formidable intelligence and moral seriousness, and in the company of a woman who liked lightness and wit, and the deft, elliptical communication of intelligent people who understand each other without requiring everything to be spelled out. This was exhausting. But the conflict between Victoria and Gladstone was not merely a matter of personal chemistry. It also reflected genuine political differences of substance. Gladstone was committed to parliamentary government in a way that sometimes seemed to Victoria to encroach on the prerogatives of the Crown. He was committed to Irish Home Rule, the policy of giving Ireland its own parliament to manage its domestic affairs, in a way that Victoria found both constitutionally alarming and personally repugnant. She was deeply opposed to Home Rule, seeing it as the first step in the dissolution of the United Kingdom, and she made her opposition clear in ways that went beyond what a constitutional monarch was strictly entitled to do. The relationship reached its nadir in the mid-1880s, when Gladstone's second ministry was attempting to deal with the Gordon crisis, the crisis that resulted from the death of General Charles Gordon at Khartoum in January 1885. Gordon had been sent to evacuate the Egyptian and British garrisons from the Sudan, which was being swept by the forces of a religious movement known as the Mahdiya. He had decided, characteristically, to stay rather than evacuate, and had held Khartoum against a siege for months, expecting a relief expedition to reach him. The relief expedition, delayed by political hesitation in London, arrived 2 days after Khartoum fell and Gordon was killed. Victoria's fury at the government's handling of the crisis was spectacular. She sent a telegram to Gladstone, and pointedly did not encipher it, so that it was read by every telegraph operator between Windsor and London, expressing her feelings with a directness that was far beyond the norms of constitutional monarchy. She was blamed for being theatrical and partisan. She was also, it must be said, expressing what many of her subjects felt. Gordon had been a genuinely popular figure, a soldier saint of the empire, and his death through governmental delay was a genuine cause of national anger. The Gordon crisis illustrated the tensions that Victoria's personality created in the constitutional system. She was not temperamentally suited to the passive role that modern constitutional theory assigned to the monarch. She had strong opinions, she expressed them forcefully, and she was not willing to be simply a rubber stamp for the decisions of her ministers, even when those decisions had been made through entirely constitutional processes. These qualities had sometimes been assets. Her engagement with political life meant she was a genuine participant in it, not merely a figurehead, and the quality of her judgment at its best was considerable. But they also created friction and occasionally confusion about the proper scope of royal influence in a parliamentary democracy. Chapter 16, The Later Reign and Empire and Its Discontents. The last 2 decades of the 19th century were years of extraordinary complexity for Britain and for Victoria. The empire had reached its greatest extent. British power and British commerce reached into every corner of the globe. The economy had made Britain the workshop of the world. The reforms of the mid-Victorian era in education, in public health, in the conditions of labor, had improved the lives of millions of people in ways that were real and measurable. The culture of the era had produced literature and art and music of enduring quality, from the novels of George Eliot and Thomas Hardy, to the paintings of the Preraphaelites, to the music of Gilbert and Sullivan. But underneath the surface of this achievement ran deep currents of unease. The industrial economy that had created Britain's prosperity was also creating new forms of poverty and inequality. The cities that were the engines of industrial production were also, in their slums and rookeries and overcrowded tenements, places of misery that reformers and social investigators documented with increasing urgency. Charles Booth's monumental survey of the life and labor of the people of London, published in the 1880s and 1890s, revealed that nearly a third of the population of the richest city in the world lived in poverty. The women's movement was gathering strength, demanding the right to vote, to own property, to attend universities, to practice professions, demands that challenged the fundamental assumptions about gender and power on which Victorian society had been built. The trade union movement was growing, as working-class people organized to demand better wages and conditions from the employers who depended on their labor. The socialism that was beginning to develop as a